For many centuries, Turkey, rich in tradition, has served as the bridge between two continents. Lying partly in Europe and partly in Asia, Turkey has long been a meeting place for the cultures of the Eastern and Western worlds. Its history is closely linked with the rise and fall of many civilizations and empires. Most important city in Turkey is called Istanbul, which, as Constantinople, was the capital of the Roman Empire in the East in the early Christian era. Its ancient mosques are no longer filled with worshippers, since Mohammedanism was discarded as a state religion. But they remain symbols of the great Ottoman Empire, which at its height embraced under the Muslim faith most of Asia Minor and North Africa, and all Eastern Europe up to the gates of Vienna. Against the walls of Constantinople's ancient fortresses, countless armies have flung themselves. Barbarian hordes from the north, waves of Christian crusaders, and the conquering Ottoman Turks. Today, Turkey is a nation hopefully pursuing the paths of peace. But conditioned by centuries of war, Turkey is always on guard. For though its battered fortresses have not been besieged for many years, its people well know that Turkey's geographical position is such that they may live to see the invasion of their country's soil again. Through centuries of greatness and glory long dead, through centuries of decadence and poverty, Istanbul has retained its prime strategic importance as the link between two great continents. Today, over the streets of Istanbul, power politics hangs as a dark and constant threat. For it is Turkey's misfortune that she is a weak nation, precariously situated between Europe and Asia, where the interests of strong nations converge and conflict. To the north lie the USSR and her neighboring satellites. To the south lie the oil-rich lands of the Middle East and the Suez Canal, traditional lifeline of the British Empire. Within Turkey's borders are the Dardanelles, western gateway to the narrow straits leading out of the Black Sea, and Russia's only means of access to the warm Mediterranean. Gallipoli is one of the Turkish army's fortified zones guarding the Straits of the Dardanelles, by authority of an international agreement signed in 1936. Today, for fear of losing her independence, Turkey is firmly resisting Russia's insistent demands that Soviet troops, in violation of the agreement, be allowed to help guard the Dardanelles. At the eastern end of the Straits, beyond the inland Sea of Marmara, lies the Bosporus, which completes Turkish control of water traffic in and out of the Black Sea. Through this bottleneck controlled by Turkey, must pass all shipping to and from Russia's most important warm water ports, a fact that has irked Russia for centuries and has made the narrow straits the cause of several wars. From ancient times, the strategic importance of the straits was recognized, but they first became an issue in modern politics during the 18th century, when Russia made a strong move toward expansion southward. 100 years later, furthering his country's ambition to become a naval power, Tsar Nicholas II intensified Russia's efforts to gain access through the straits to ice-free waters. During World War I, Russia's Black Sea fleet was effectively bottled up. Its thrust at the straits, in answer to overt acts by Turkey, was one in a chain of events which prompted Turkey to enter the war as an ally of Germany. In a historic naval battle near the Bosporus, Turkey's warships routed the Russian force, which suffered the loss of several ships and did not again threaten the straits for the duration of the war. Following the end of World War I, the straits upon which depended access to Russia's Black Sea ports were placed under international control. But freedom of access was complete for merchant vessels, and in the 2 decades between the wars, such ports as Odessa grew and flourished. Trade with nations in both hemispheres increased, and Russia was able to bring in, through the Mediterranean and the Straits, in all seasons of the year, the machinery which she so badly needed for the country's development. In 1936, the signing of the Montreux Convention gave Turkey the right to remilitarize the Straits, thus restoring to her the control she had lost after the First World War. Throughout World War II, Turkey, protecting her neutrality, cut off all passage of warships to and from the Black Sea. Since the war, Russia has persistently sought, through every political expedient, to take joint control of the Straits with Turkey, a move which would leave Russia in effective possession. So far, these proposals have all been rejected. Turkey's position makes her today the block between Russia and the Middle East. And behind her thinly fortified borders, she lives under the shadow of the Colossus to the north. At garrisons strung out along the borders, from Bulgaria to the Russian Caucasus, Turkish patrols are on the alert for frontier incidents which the Soviet might use as an excuse to move against its neighbor. By such vigilance, open warfare has been so far averted, though for years there have been clashes between sentries and bands of armed men infiltrating from across the boundaries of Russia and Bulgaria. Behind these lonely patrols is the mass of the Turkish army, some 600,000 strong. Though made up of men who are warriors by tradition, the Turkish army is limited in modern equipment and could not long withstand the weight of Russia. Yet its very presence has been enough to ward off typical Russian encroachments. The army, built by Turkey's military leaders, is a severe drain on Turkey's resources, with military appropriations consuming almost half the national budget. Officers' training schools are drawing off Turkey's most promising young men, desperately needed as civilian leaders in the development of the country. Turkey feels that, second only to her military establishment, her security depends on continued friendship with the United States. In accordance with the Truman Doctrine, the United States has authorized over $100 million for military aid to Turkey. U.S. Ambassador Edwin C. Wilson, closeted with Turkey's high officials, irons out details pertaining to policies and terms connected with the United States aid program. Arrivals of official missions from the United States are sending Turkey's hopes of maintaining her independence soaring higher. For these missions offer visible proof to an anxious people that American support is a reassuring reality. And the concrete financial aid, which the American representatives are assisting Turkish officials to administer, makes the economic and military problems ahead much less critical to Turkey's government. Heading this government today is President İsmet Inonu, who since 1938 has been wrestling with Turkey's manifold difficulties. Inonu is the strong man of his country, though he is assisted by his prime minister and a cabinet. There is also the National Assembly. Of the membership of the Assembly, 85% belong to Inonu's Republican People's Party, which has kept a tight grip on the reins of government since 1924, and was until recently the only party. Seat of government and show window of Turkey is its capital city, Ankara, whose broad avenues and modern buildings rise out of an Anatolian plateau where a quarter of a century ago there stood only a primitive provincial town. Builder of Ankara and father of modern Turkey was Kemal Ataturk, hero of the revolution which followed World War I. In 1922, rousing the Turkish people to patriotic fury, Ataturk drove out the Greek armies which had occupied part of Turkey with the support of the Allies. Achieving Turkish independence, Kemal Ataturk set out to change a backward Oriental despotism into a modern republic. Beginning with his cabinet, he forced his people to adopt the Latin alphabet in place of the complicated Arabic script and ordered the country modernized and westernized from top to bottom. Strongly uniting his people, Ataturk ruled with a firm hand until he died in 1938. Today, to replace the crypt in which he lies, the government is building a new mausoleum to do him honor. On the leveled off top of one of the highest hills around Ankara, the foundations are being laid for a memorial which will take years to complete and will cost about $5 million. But despite the splendor of the monument to the founder of modern Turkey, the people living on the hills behind Ankara, the common folk who revere his memory, are little better off for all that he attempted to do. Today, most of Turkey's 19 million people are just about as poorly housed, as badly paid and as shabbily dressed as were their grandfathers. Out of the nation's heavily burdensome taxes, so much goes to support the army that little is left over to provide decent housing or adequate education. Eking out a hand-to-mouth living by selling the produce of his small farm in nearby marketplaces, the average rural Turk is still backward and ignorant by Western standards. Predominantly a farming country whose transportation is primitive and whose industries have been neglected, Turkey depends heavily on one major export crop, tobacco. But the growers can sell to only one customer, the government agent, for tobacco is one of the state's many monopolies. Even factories have been set up by the government because private citizens lack sufficient capital to start important enterprises of their own. Almost 7% of the leaf used in American cigarettes comes from Turkey. And for this, U.S. firms pay over $45 million a year. In addition, Turkish tobacco products sell throughout the world. Thanks to tobacco and to many raw materials needed by both sides during the war, Turkey's exports have exceeded her imports for several years. This favorable balance of export trade has been perhaps the greatest single factor in propping up her shaky financial structure. But little money trickles down to the great masses of the Turkish people. The average income among 80% of the population is seldom more than $50 a year. Of Turkey's 19 million people, more than 4/5 work at the country's primary occupation, farming, which is still conducted in primitive fashion. It is estimated that were it not for the handicap of ancient equipment and methods, Turkish farmers, even allowing for the present labor shortage, could quadruple their production. But the average peasants have to be content with the basic necessities they are able to buy with their small earnings. In an effort to improve conditions, farm machinery is being made available in some districts through government-sponsored cooperatives. By means of a system of large rural schools called village institutes, the government is trying to better agricultural production methods and to raise the standards of living and working. Boys and girls are taught both practical and cultural subjects, which they in turn agree to teach in the smaller rural schools back home. In some crafts, such as weaving, old people are brought in as instructors to pass their skills on to the young. There are only 21 village institutes, but their combined influence is widespread. Though the number of primary and secondary schools is still inadequate, Turkey has made notable advances in streamlining its educational system. Elementary schooling in Turkey today is free and compulsory for a period of 5 years. The 12,000 schools are so crowded that many must operate on a double schedule. Studies include reading, arithmetic, handwriting, history, and geography, with special emphasis placed on civics and the building of well-informed good citizens. Today, an increasing percentage of Turkish children progress to junior and senior high schools. Many go on to institutions of higher learning like the University of Ankara. Here, women, teachers, and students are accepted on the same terms as men, in contrast to their lot in the old days when they were kept secluded, veiled, and illiterate. Promising that, as the people were sufficiently educated, they would be entrusted with a greater measure of democracy, the government has granted the right of assembly to an opposition party. Though the minority leaders are kept cautiously within bounds, the government is already finding the members of the new Democrat Party, some of them former colleagues of Ataturk, embarrassingly insistent on airing their grievances and demanding more and more political rights. Turkey's newspapers, always controlled by the government, have begun to speak out with unaccustomed forthrightness. Even friendly editors have gone so far as to criticize the government openly, and some papers have dared to allege government interference in recent elections. But in foreign affairs, Turkish newspapers fully support the government's policies. They report with approval its efforts to cultivate neighboring potentates, whose friendly offices might be useful in case of trouble. Putting on a round of entertainment for Middle Eastern rulers like the King of Transjordan, Emir Abdullah ibn Hussein, Turkish officialdom and society go all out for lavish Oriental hospitality, including the fullest freedom of the banqueting board. Today, Turkey's interests extend far beyond the Middle East. The Turkish people have an active curiosity about the Western world. This activity is arousing an intense interest in the United States among the Turkish people. The U.S. Information Service at Istanbul attracts many young Turks eager to learn about America and things American. And with the visits of U.S. warships to Turkish ports, many Turks who have long admired and emulated Western ways are coming face to face with representatives of the great Republic of the West. Today, in a new meeting of peoples and ideas, Turkey is finding not only aid from the United States and the prospect of continued independence, but also a new breath of freedom and a new will to bring into being the democracy her people have so long been promised.